Hello and welcome to The Hindu. Today we have with us a special guest, Mr. P. Chidambaram, the former finance minister of the country, and he's come up with a new book called The Watershed Year, Which Way Will India Go? Mr. Chidambaram, happy to have you with us. Yeah.
Good evening.
I would like to start with the first questions about I remember watching your budget speech. I mean, your reply to the current finance minister's budget speech a few years ago, where you particularly emphasized the point of structural reforms and how something similar to the 1991 structural reforms and how such reforms are really, really rare, and the NDA government really hasn't done anything at all. So, if you can elaborate on that, I think that's a very important point.
The major structural reforms were done in 1991 to 1996 when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister. After that, tax structural reforms were done in 1996 to 1998. Between 2004 and 2014, there were international events which disrupted the economy. Nevertheless, major structural reforms were done in the security market and in some other areas. Now, since 2014, I cannot think of an area where there were structural reforms. There have been reforms, there have been changes, but I can't put my finger on structural reforms. If you ask them, they will say GST is a structural reform. I agree. GST is a structural reform, an idea that was mooted by me in my budget speech, and I'm happy that they passed the GST laws. But the GST laws have actually disrupted existing trade and existing structures. They have not replaced it by a better structure. In fact, if you ask the traders and the business people, what is the one thing that you would like to be done if a new government takes over? They will say, please repeal these GST laws. Similarly, IBC is a structural reform. You proposed an insolvency and bankruptcy system. But look at the results of the IBC. Less than 20% of the bank loans or the financial creditors' dues are being recovered through the IBC. On the contrary, the resolution plan applicant, the guy who's coming to take over, is taking over huge assets for a very, very small amount. Eventually, the banks are left with unpaid NPAs. And what are they doing? They call it, still keeping it in the books, although it's wiped out under the IBC, and they sell it to asset reconstruction firms. So it is not helping anyway either the bank's balance sheet, and many of these IBC companies which have been taken over have closed down. The idea is to revive it and run it. It's not liquidation, it's insolvency. There is a separate chapter on liquidation. That's a different matter. But insolvency has not revived a large number of companies. Yes, some companies have been revived, but not many companies have been revived. Therefore, I think this government lost its plot on structural reforms. And anyway, in the last 3 or 4, 5 years, they have done no structural reform at all.
So how would you see, let's say, from 2014 to until the pandemic, we could see that the early growth rates kind of started to drop, and particularly right before the pandemic, for several consecutive quarters, we could see the growth rate dropped. And obviously, with the pandemic, things just went really bad. But after the pandemic and right now, particularly because a lot of critics have been saying there's been no reform, so growth is just stuck. But since the last 1 year, after the pandemic, the growth numbers have surprised a lot. So how would you explain that?
You see, the decline in growth rate started in the year prior to that pandemic. The pandemic and the lockdown were in March 2020. But in 2019-20 itself, the growth rate had declined sharply. So you can't blame the decline in the growth rate to the pandemic. Yes, the pandemic deepened the decline, accelerated the decline. So forget those 2 years. But what about the years thereafter? They boasted of a V-shaped recovery, and I demonstrated with charts. With several people have demonstrated it's not a V-shaped recovery. The deeper you fall, the rise will be the other vector of the V. So if you fall, say, 12%, if you rise even 8%, it'll look like a V. If you drop 20% and you rise 5%, it'll look like a V. Therefore, the V is not unusual. The deeper you drop, there will be another vector where you rise. The question is, what is the annual growth rate? What is the growth rate in per capita income? What is the growth rate in real wages? Now it's been completely established that the growth rate declined, number one. Number two, per capita income has risen at a much lesser rate. And number three, for the last 4 years, real wages have been stagnant. In fact, real wages of agricultural labor has actually dropped. Therefore, how can you call this remarkable recovery? There is some recovery, but it is a K-shaped recovery. A small section has recovered sharply, but the big section has declined. So it's a K with a small line rising somewhere near the top, and then the bulk of the people declining.
So, but how would you explain the divergence between the headline GDP figure the government says is like 7.6 and numbers, and these all other things like per capita income, real wages, they're not really going anywhere. So is it a statistical?
If you believe the government's numbers, why does the MOSPI, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and the CSO, the Central Statistics Organization, constantly revise these numbers? There is no certainty about numbers at all. I can understand there is a first revision, a second revision, but they are constantly revising the numbers. And the last thing they did was change the base. The base was always 2011-12. I think they have now changed it to 2016-17. Why change the base in the middle of your 10-year term? And the Niti Aayog's numbers are totally suspect. Niti Aayog put out a poverty decline number. Nobody is accepting that poverty decline number. Therefore, there is no credibility to these numbers. And if you believe in Dr. Raghuram Rajan's writings and other writings, the average growth rate is much lower than what the government projects.
My next question is about, you say that the BJP does not have the leaders or the vision to reset India's economic policies. And you also particularly mentioned that other parties are not interested in resetting India's policies either. So that seems like a bleak picture. Would that include the Congress as well?
There is, in my view, nobody in the government today who is able to think of policies which are going to benefit the economy over the next 10, 20 years. Is there anyone equal to Dr. Manmohan Singh? Is there in the Economic Council of Advisors anyone equal to Dr. Rangarajan or Dr. Kelkar? There's nobody. In the administration, is there anybody equal to Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Dr. Shankaracharya, Dr. Y.V. Reddy? There's nobody. Can you name 3 officers in key ministries or 3 ministers in the government or in the Council of Economic Advisors who are acknowledged as world-class economists? Therefore, there is no talent inside the government, and they suspect anyone from outside giving them advice.
Another thing that we see the government boasting about is usually the that we're going to be a $5 trillion economy, or these huge, large scale figures that kind of attract a lot of ordinary people who don't really understand economics, but they don't really go look into the actual living standard figures of like the per capita income or real wages that you mentioned about. So you see that this 5 trillion, whatever, the huge GDP numbers are appealing to the voters. So what exactly is the opposition doing to, like, counter this? Because right now everyone feels that the economy is doing great and the GDP is doing great. So what, as an opposition leader, what do you do?
The 5 trillion goal was set. When they set it, they said we will reach it in 23, 24. It's been pushed back to 25, 26. The chief economic advisor pushed it back to 26, 27. Now the latest deadline is 27, 28. Now, what is the idea of a moving goalpost? And they say, I'm reaching 5 trillion, I'm reaching 5 trillion. It's an arithmetical inevitability. Whether there is a government or not, whether we grow at 5% or 8%, you will reach 5 trillion one day. Question is, how long will it take to reach 5 trillion at a 5% growth, and how long will it take to reach 5 trillion at an 8% growth? Nobody talks about that. All right. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. And every day the government trumpets that we will soon become the 3rd largest economy in the world. That's again another arithmetical inevitability. If you have 140 crore population going up to 160 crore, you will become the 2nd largest economy. Why do you say you will be the 3rd largest economy? The point is, in terms of per capita income, we are something like 143. In GDP, we may be 5, we may move up to 4 and go up to 3 and even 2. But in per capita income, we are 143. In global hunger index, we are 101. So this number of 5 trillion GDP economy is completely irrelevant.
So another point that you mentioned is that the government is satisfied with 6% growth and 6% inflation and 8% unemployment. And you compare that with the expectation of governments in the past, which are okay with like 5% growth and 5% inflation or unemployment that you mentioned. So can you go into like why exactly these numbers matter? Like what is the human cost of? Because I remember like Swaminathan Iyer or whatever, a columnist, estimated that because of the lack of structural reforms, so many children are going to be malnourished and things like that. So if you can like shed light on that, as well as like if you compare like countries like Japan or South Korea that kind of grew from what we were, so when they had similar income levels as us, like we do right now, what was the pace at which they grew, and so where exactly are we lagging? Yeah.
See, there are different growth patterns in different parts of the world at different times. America, for example, increased its GDP by 5 times over a period of 45 years. Whereas South Korea, Japan have increased their GDP 5 times in much shorter time, something like 20 years. China has increased its GDP by 5.5 times in about 25 years or so. One point of time, India's GDP and China's GDP were more or less the same. And in per capita income, they were only about $20 more than us. Today, their GDP per capita income is 5.5 times more than us. So it's over a period of time you'll have to measure. Now, if we grow at 8%, our per capita will become that of a middle income country, which is about $13,000 in X years. But if we grow at 6% or less, it will take much longer. We will never catch up with America or Switzerland or some of the Liechtenstein. We'll never catch up because we have a 160 crore population by 2050 or so. Therefore, I'm not so concerned about the GDP. I'm only concerned about when will we become a middle income country? When will our $2,400 per capita become 13,000 or 12,000 or 13,000 dollar per capita? It's going to take a long, long time. This government has no idea of how long it will take given our growth rate. I'm afraid this government has accepted and reconciled itself to a 6% growth. For example, in the 10 years of UPA, 2004 to 2014, we grew at about 7.5, 7.6% average. Now, the growth rate of these 10 years, 2014 to 2024, is only 5.7 or 5.8, giving their inflated numbers. You accept those inflated numbers, it will still be only 5.8. The difference is not insignificant. The difference may look like 1.7 or 1.6 or 1.8, but that difference of 1.7 makes a huge difference to how fast we will grow. I'm afraid this government has mentally reconciled itself to a 6% growth and is proud of saying we are the fastest growing large economy. It's like being the one-eyed monarch of the blind. If everybody is blind, the one-eyed person will be the monarch, will be the king. So I don't accept 6% growth. If our government was there, we will work towards restoring 8% growth. We had 9% growth for 3 years between 2005-06 and 2008-09. We will restore 8% growth. They are settling for 6% growth, and I criticize them for that. They are also settling for 8% unemployment. Who talks about unemployment in this country? Who talks about job-creating policies? The IT industry alone in 2023, calendar year 2023, the IT industry alone laid off over 240,000 workers. Now that's continuing into 2024. Nobody's appreciating or realizing that the faster technology will be introduced in this country, jobs will be shed. New jobs will be created, but you must focus on the new job creation. Where is this government talking about new job creation? They are playing with EPF numbers and ESI numbers and saying so many people have enrolled in the register and therefore these jobs have... I mean, even a child knows this is all rubbish. More people are formalized in the EPF, but more people leave the EPF also. More people are formalized in ESI, they also leave the ESI. We need to get data on how many actual jobs are being created. Now, if jobs are being created in the non-agricultural sector, why should the number of agricultural people dependent on agriculture as a livelihood keep increasing? Instead of migrating from the agricultural sector to the non-agricultural sector, the numbers in the agricultural sector are rising in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Therefore, I think they've settled for 8% unemployment and 6% growth. Now, the middle number, inflation, if you left it to the RBI totally, the RBI may be able to bring down inflation between the 2 to 4% band. But the RBI is no longer as autonomous as it was in, say, Dr. Rangarajan or Dr. Reddy or Dr. Rajan's time.
I also want to get into the whole of, we had the 1991 structural reforms that the Congress implemented. So let's say the Congress comes back to power in 2024. What would be the actual structural, like what are the pockets of the economy that you think actually need, focus when it comes to structural reforms?
There are several. There has to be a massive restructuring of the tax policies. See, for example, I reduced the highest marginal rate of income tax to 30. It's crept back now to 41. We are going in the reverse gear. Whereas corporate tax has been reduced to 22. Number one. I'll give you another example. Our government moved towards a greater share of direct taxes than indirect taxes. And in fact, we achieved the target that direct taxes constituted 50 plus and indirect taxes constituted 50 minus. Today, the situation is reversed. It is indirect taxes which are more than the direct tax collection. Now, direct taxes is based on income. People who earn more pay more tax. But indirect taxes is a scheduler rate. It applies to everybody. If I buy a pair of shoes or slippers, the richest man in India, if he buys that same pair of shoes and slippers, he will pay the same tax and you will pay the same tax. So indirect taxes is equal to both the rich and the poor, whereas direct taxes fall more on the rich, and that's how any progressive taxation system should be there. So the taxation system must be reformed. And we have made it very clear, if we come to power, GST laws will be repealed and reenacted. This law will go. Lock, stock and barrel, this law will go. We will have a GST 2.0, which follows universally accepted principles of GST, namely a single rate, a low rate with very few exemptions.
Another big picture question. You say that the fate of countries that won independence in 1947 should alert us to what is possible. You also had that eventually economics will trump all other issues. So,
well, I hope so.
I hope so, yeah. So my question is like, what is the economic price that Indians are going to be willing to pay? And
Indians are already paying a price. Indians are already paying a price in terms of lower per capita income than they deserve to have. Indians are already paying a price for low wages when the wages should be increased across the board. Indians are already paying a price for lower rate of economic growth. But the worst price India will pay is a rising inequality. Now we've got those numbers. We've got the numbers from Thomas Piketty and other scholars that the top 10% own 57% of India's wealth and share about 54% or so of national income. And the bottom 50% have a fractional share of India's wealth and India's income. In fact, the difference between the bottom 20 and the top 10 has increased tremendously, many-fold in the last 10 years. If this inequality persists, if this inequality widens at the same pace over the next 10 years, next 15 years, how can you expect India to be a peaceful, harmonious society?
Thank you, Mr. Chidambaram.
Thank you.
Thank you. For more such videos and interviews, please subscribe to The Hindu.